Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage David Rothkopf, CEO and editor of the Foreign Policy Group, and Ambassador Michael Froman, United States Trade Representative.
Good morning, everybody. It is a pleasure to be here. It is a special pleasure to be here with Michael Froman, who, as the United States Trade Representative, is really doing extraordinary work. I would say that one of the great success stories of the Obama administration, particularly in the second term, has been the quality of its international economic team, led by Mike, by Fred Hochberg of Exim Bank, and by Penny Pritzker, who is an excellent Commerce Secretary. I say this with just a little regret, having once been in a less good Commerce Department. I'm not just making this up, by the way. In my column today, I say those exact same words because I think what Mike has been doing is remarkable. Among the most remarkable things that Mike has done is that he's just gotten off a plane from China, and he's here to talk to you today.
Vietnam, anyway. Vietnam and Japan.
Vietnam and Japan. And he's here to talk to you today about some of the most important breaking news that's currently taking place in Washington. And of course, by that, I mean the progress that Trade Promotion Authority has been making through the Senate and through committee yesterday. And rather than my telling you what's happening, why don't I turn to the man who's at the center of it and ask him for the status report and what things look like to you from this point onward.
Well, thanks, David. It has been a good week for a whole series of trade-related legislation, Trade Promotion Authority chief among them, where both in the Senate Finance Committee and now in the House Ways and Means Committee late last night, it was reported out of committee. Both had bipartisan votes. We also saw votes supporting the renewal of AGOA, the African Growth and Opportunity Act, the renewal of GSP, the renewal of trade adjustment assistance to help workers have the skills they need to compete, and a series of enforcement and customs measures. And so those bills will now go to the floor in both the House and the Senate, and we hope it'll move forward as quickly as possible.
And that means?
In terms of timing, well, that's obviously a congressional prerogative, but I know the leadership of both houses want to move forward quite soon on both.
And what about the rest of the TPP process? What remains?
Well, we are engaged in more or less 24/7 negotiations with our trading partners, sometimes bilaterally, and that's why I was in Japan and Vietnam earlier this week. We have small groups of countries getting together around various issues around the world, and then all 12 countries are coming together for negotiations as well as we speak. And we're making very substantial progress in closing out issues, narrowing the differences of the remaining issues, so that ultimately the hopefully handful of remaining issues that require political guidance can be teed up for the ministers.
Well, apropos of that, there was a story today in the Washington Post, which you may or may not have seen, about this Menendez amendment to the TPA legislation, which talked about denying fast track should the bill involve any country that's involved in human trafficking. And one of the countries that's had issues in that regard is Malaysia, and obviously Malaysia is part of this process. How does that get resolved?
Well, we're looking at the language that passed in the Senate. We are working with the State Department that's been in this dialogue with countries and the Department of Labor, of course, as well, because the human trafficking obviously is a very serious issue, and we want to make sure that through the kind of engagements we have, including through our trade dialogue, that we're able to encourage countries to take on the further actions that they need to take. And this is certainly part of our approach, as the President has laid out in our trade negotiations on things like labor and environment, are to use these negotiations both to disproportionately lower barriers to other markets so that we can increase our exports and support good, well-paying jobs here in the United States through increased exports, but also use these negotiations to raise standards abroad. And so this agreement, TPP, will have the strongest labor and environmental standards of any agreement, and they'll be fully enforceable. It'll have, for the first time, disciplines around state-owned enterprises, making sure that when they compete with our private firms, they do so on a fair and commercial basis. It's be the first agreement that brings into the digital economy certain principles of trade from the real economy, including the free flow of data and information across borders, which is so important to so many issues, both economic and otherwise in these countries. And so we're going to try and use these trade negotiations to further an agenda that reflects not only our interests but our values.
President Obama, I think it was yesterday, referred to this as the most progressive trade agreement that has ever existed. Right. I assume the elements you're talking about are part of that. Is there a broader agenda here with regard to our trade dialogue elsewhere, as in TTIP or other places? Should the world expect a change from the U.S.?
Well, yes, I think so. I mean, when the president came into office, he made clear that if we're going to do trade agreements, we've got to do trade right. And that meant ensuring that it was good for our workers here, good for for production here in the United States, but also very much reflecting our values. He talked about renegotiating NAFTA, and that meant bringing labor and environment into the core of the agreement, making them firm obligations and making them fully enforceable. And that's what TPP does, but not just with Canada and Mexico, but with 40% of the global economy. And when we're done with TTIP, with the European Union, where I'm sure we'll have strong provisions of this sort, we will have taken the global trading system, 2/3 of the global trading system, into an area where these kinds of issues, like labor and the environment, or disciplines on SOEs, or digital economy, the free flow of information, a free and open internet, that those now become central tenets of the global trading system. And so it is important as part of that.
One of the things that strikes me as so remarkable about this is that a few years ago, people were shoveling dirt on global trade negotiations. You know, you were coming out of Cancun, Doha, ground to a halt. There was this sense that perhaps they'd lost steam. And here in the United States, you had a kind of a reversal where in the past, trade legislation has seen bipartisanship, particularly from the center of both parties. You had a kind of a joining of forces of the far left and the far right in opposition to trade that seemed to have slowed things down dramatically. And yet here you are, you've got TPA, you just mentioned a long list of other things. TTIP discussions are beginning in some earnest. What happened? What changed in the past couple of years?
Well, look, I think there's increased recognition that we're very much part of a global economy. And that has various dimensions to it. Certainly, globalization affects us here in the United States, and that's why it's so important that we use these agreements to raise standards around the world. But we also know that if we want to get back to full employment and the kind of jobs that we want here, high-paying jobs, because we know that export-related jobs pay, on average, 18% more than non-export-related jobs, we need to have access to these markets abroad. If we're going to have the kind of growth and job creation and wage increases that we want to see in this country, we need to have access, particularly to the fastest-growing markets of the world in Asia. Now, the Asian markets right now have about 540 million middle-class consumers. And that number is expected to grow to over 3 billion in the next 15 years. And the question is, whose products are they going to buy? And we want them to buy made in America, grown in America, manufactured products, agricultural products, services. We want to be part of that middle-class consumer market. And that means we can't afford to be standing on the sidelines while other countries are carving up markets and setting rules of the road that are not consistent with our interests and our values. And I think that recognition is increasing, and as a result, when people see what else is going on in the international community, whether it's China negotiating its own set of trade agreements or otherwise, that we need to be engaged and take leadership and help define the rules of the road ourselves.
Well, let me talk about that, because clearly China on PPP terms is a bigger economy. It's getting bigger all the time. It's a vital part of our trade future, clearly. But they do have a strategy. They are negotiating trade agreements. They're investing money in infrastructure in the region bilaterally. They've just announced the Asian Infrastructure and Investment Bank, which we took a stance against, and many of our allies are now part of. So they have a strategy for expanding their role in the region. We have TPP, which they're not part of. Clearly, I think, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but my sense of TPP is that part of the objective is to create a strong group to which China would aspire to join, and thus have to raise its standards in order to get into the system. But beyond that, and correct me if that's not the case, how do you see convergence and reconciling between China's strategy in the region and ours?
Well, look, our approach is not directed toward or against any particular country, but it is directed at saying that we think the rules of the road for this region, which is vitally important, ought to be of high standards. And through TPP, we're now negotiating these high standard rules. And we think that's important for the region, it's important for the U.S., it's important for supporting workers and businesses based in the U.S., which is, of course, our number one goal. At the same time, we're working very closely with China to address a whole range of issues that affect our bilateral relationship, whether it's having to do with intellectual property rights enforcement or market access for our manufactured and agricultural products, or the bilateral investment treaty that we're negotiating, which will help spur on reform in that country. And so it's important that we do both. But the key thing is that we want to make sure that the trading system going forward, and this very much reflects what the President has been saying, the trading system going forward is a high standard trading system, one that takes into account critical issues like labor, the environment, a free and open internet, and a level playing field between state-owned enterprises and private firms.
Okay, so I don't want to cross any red lines here. Nobody's discussed this issue with me beforehand, but it seems relevant in this context. China's out there, it's active. Other countries are out there, they're active. They're trying to build trade. The president of China just got back from a trip to Pakistan where they promised $46 billion in investment. They've got their checkbook out. They're doing everything in their power. And right now there's a movement among some people in Congress to shut down Exim Bank, to take some of our tools off the table. What's your view of that, and how do the countries you're dealing with overseas look at it?
Well, look, I think it's a very good point that you make, and obviously we think it's critical that Exim be reauthorized. There's 60 countries out there that have the equivalent of export-import banks. Ours is not the largest by far. I mean, you do a multiple of what Exim does in terms of financing, but Exim's absolutely critical to supporting exports, supporting small businesses that are exporting, and supporting the jobs, over 1 million jobs that go along with those exports. And so to not reauthorize Exim is really like unilateral disarmament here in a very competitive environment, and we think it's very important that it be reauthorized.
Okay. Let me switch oceans for a second. I think one of the great traditions, actually, of U.S. trade policy, such as it is for trade wonks like me, who sort of follow these things, is not just the bipartisanship, but that often a deal will begin in one administration of one party and end in another administration of another party, and both will have ended up not only working on the same goals, but sending a message to the world that it doesn't matter what the political changes in the U.S. has goals. And this was true with TPP, which had origins before this administration. TTIP may take a while. It may lead into the next administration. But what's your vision for revisiting the relationship that we have economically with the countries that are also strategically our most important political allies? And how does the economic play into the strategic?
Well, they're both very important. I mean, first and foremost, trade agreements need to be based and justified on their economic grounds. They've got to be evaluated on their capacity to support growth, jobs, strengthen the middle class here in the U.S. But they also have strategic importance. TPP is a key part of our rebalancing strategy towards Asia, maybe one of the most concrete manifestations of that. And you've heard Secretary Carter, among others, and Secretary Kerry yesterday talk about that. And with regard to TTIP, what started off as an initiative really designed to help spur growth coming out of the financial crisis, the much needed growth, particularly in Europe, through trade integration, has taken on new strategic importance with what's going on in the periphery of Europe, with Russia and Ukraine. We already have a strong economic relationship with Europe. We have a strong political and strategic relationship with Europe. But TTIP is now a very important contributor, potentially, to strengthening that transatlantic relationship. And I think it helps underscore the importance of getting it done, and getting it done as soon as possible. And there's no reason why we can't get it done in a reasonable amount of time, given that the U.S. and the EU have negotiated several FTAs with other countries. We know each other's approaches on probably 80% of the issues. We see things in similar ways, and now we're focusing on the 20% where that are the most important, but and the most difficult, of where we need to find solutions.
Does that mean within this administration's tenure?
Yeah, I think there's no reason it can't be done within this administration's tenure. Absolutely, and we want to make sure we negotiate the best possible agreement for our mutual interests, and we'll take whatever time that takes. But there's no reason it can't be done in this administration.
One of the things that was the impediment around Doha, and in fact one of the great deal breakers and problem areas in terms of global trade reform generally, has been agricultural policy. And some have seen hope in TTIP, in that this is a moment where both the United States and Europe, which have strong agricultural subsidies programs and others, might stop and say, for a variety of economic reasons, this is a time to begin a kind of a mutual drawback, not in a way that's damaging to the ag sector, but in a way that creates freer and more open markets. Is that a possibility in the context of this kind of deal?
Well, agricultural subsidies ultimately would have to be dealt with as a multilateral issue, because it's not just that you're subsidizing vis-a-vis each other, you're subsidizing vis-a-vis the whole global economy. What's interesting over the last 10 or 15 years is that U.S. subsidies and EU subsidies have actually come down. They've had their CAP reform, we've had our own reform of our farm programs. But the subsidies of agriculture from China and India have increased, and in some cases are significantly higher than ours. And so if we're going to get at this issue of agricultural subsidies on a multilateral level, it's going to require not just the U.S. and EU taking some decisions, but it's going to require China and India signing on as well. Because if you're a poor subsistence farmer in sub-Saharan Africa, it doesn't matter whether the subsidy came from China or the U.S., you're still being adversely affected potentially, and that means that we've got to get China and India to the table as well. We can't just pick up where we left off. We've got to look afresh at what is the real situation of subsidies now, and that's part of the discussion going on in Geneva, is how to update our understanding of the flows of subsidies and how it's affecting the global economy.
Well, that's sort of one issue on the horizon. You mentioned data. Clearly, we have a situation that's emerging in the world right now where ever more of the global economy is traveling through the infosphere, where we thought the internet was going to bring down barriers and open up markets, but in which, particularly in the wake of the NSA and Snowden revelations, we've had a kind of a resurgence of what you might call cyber nationalism. Countries saying we're going to control the internet within our borders, we are going to create new regulations, we are going to set different kinds of privacy standards and so forth, and that could have a really debilitating effect on global trade integration in 21st century terms. You mentioned it's involved in TPP. I'm just wondering what the broader strategy is on those issues.
Well, it's absolutely critical to the modern economy and where it's heading. It's critical to innovation, and it's critical to the integration, particularly of small and medium-sized businesses in the global economy. I meet with small and medium-sized businesses all the time, and many of them are engaging in the global economy through e-commerce. And when they sell a product on eBay or on Etsy to consumers around the world, they're using computer services, telecommunication services, software services, electronic payment services, and express delivery services. And those are all services that we're trying to deal with in TPP to make sure that those markets are open, that there is a free flow of data and information across borders so that companies don't have to move abroad in order to serve a market. They can stay in the U.S. and serve customers abroad. And the same thing is true with Europe, where I think as people understand how much their companies are integrated through the flow of information and data across borders, that we'll have to deal with that in the context of TTIP, recognizing, very importantly, and taking fully into account legitimate privacy concerns. And I'm convinced that there are ways that we can reconcile both the free flow of data and information on one hand and legitimate privacy concerns on the other.
Okay. I'm seeing these clocks that are in front of us run down towards the last minute we've got. And I think, if I may, I'd just like to return back to the first topic on TPP because it's most imminent. Let's assume you get TPA, and let's assume a deal gets wrapped up. Where do the benefits rack up first? Who is going to feel it in the U.S. economy earliest and sort of translate these actions into something that ultimately means jobs?
Well, the interesting thing is because this is a comprehensive agreement, it really is across the board. Whether it's in manufactured products where our chemical exporters face a 35% tariff in some countries, our auto exporters face an 80% tariff in some of these countries, as well as a raft of non-tariff measures, which we're getting at through these negotiations. Machinery, up to 50% tariffs in some of these countries, and these are countries that are buying a lot of machinery. As they grow and as they're producing infrastructure, they're going to need to buy our machinery as well. And we're competing oftentimes with producers from China or ASEAN who face no tariffs into these markets, or much lower tariffs. And so we'll be able to compete better both in relative and in absolute terms. On the agriculture side, we'll see access on whether it's on beef or pork or corn or soybeans or any number of products that we export tremendous amounts of. We now export over $150 billion of agricultural products a year, all-time high. And the one thing about as a middle class emerges in Asia, the first thing they want is more protein, and they want better nutrition, and they want safer food. And grown in America products fit all of the needs that they have, and so we expect high growth there. And then of course for services, the ones I just mentioned, whether it's electronic payment services or express delivery services or architectural and engineering services, these are all services that we're liberalizing through this trade agreement. And our expertise, we're a huge services exporter. We have a surplus in our export of services. We expect this to be a major area of opportunity as well. And all of those support good jobs here in the U.S., jobs that pay more on average than non-export related jobs. So it's a way of dealing with the wage issues and the inequality issues as well.
Okay, thank you very much. I think you have all seen from this virtuosic coverage of the issues that are on the horizon why this has been a good week in U.S. trade, why so much progress has been made, and why the U.S. trade agenda right now is as vital, active, and likely to show real progress and has been at any time since the turn of this century. A lot of that has to do with the energy of the people behind it and the person who is leading it, which is Ambassador Michael Froman. Please join me in thanking Mike for this presentation.